first speaker is Jason Hafemeister, who's actually from California. You have the bios of the speakers that are out on the table. And he is the director for WTO agricultural negotiations at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. He is a UC graduate, and he knows a lot about California agriculture. And he will be followed by A.G. Kawamura, who is also a UC graduate and who is from Orange County and a strawberry and vegetable producer, and he is the California Secretary of Food and Agriculture. So we want to begin with Doha and then talk first about the more global and national picture and then switch to the California picture. And I invite Jason Hafemeister.
All right, thanks. Good morning. Good to see you all, and thanks for inviting me out. Happy to talk about Doha and agriculture. And what I'd like to do is basically hit three things in a presentation here. First, very generally to talk about the types of principles that we bring to bear in trade negotiations. Second, focus in on how those principles are applied in the WTO rules and commitments. And then third, talk about where we are in the WTO negotiations to give you some sense of what possible outcomes might be if we reach an agreement in the Doha negotiations in the WTO. And I'll try and keep it short enough so that when we finish at the end, if there are specific questions that you all are interested in, you can let me know, because I want to make sure I hit on the things that are on your minds rather than what I want to talk about. So first, let me talk a little bit on the biggest stage here when we talk about what we try and do in trade negotiations. And I think the best way to look at it is the strong consensus still in Washington, in the political system, is that trade policy really is not a whole lot different from any other economic policy. And that if you reduce distortions in markets, if you limit government intervention to where it's needed rather than to where you're creating winners and losers and creating distortions, you're going to have more coherent economic policy. You're going to then have more of a sound economy behind you. So the same way that you'd look at tax policy, the same way that you'd look at expenditures, the same way you'd look at any other sector, trade policy is really driven by the same sorts of factors. And that when you minimize the distortions and when you maximize the market forces, you're going to see more choice by consumers. You're going to see producers making decisions based on productivity and what the market says rather than what a government program says. You're going to see rewards going to producers who are more productive or who are more careful or who are more attuned to what their customers want. You're going to see investment attracted to the sector because there's a real market return. And you're going to see technology developed to follow where the market is heading. So when we look at trade policy, these are what we consider the driving forces. Now, how does that fit into the specific framework of rules and obligations that exist today in the WTO in agriculture? Well, at the first and most simple level, it means we're trying to reduce tariffs, and we're trying to ensure that where subsidy policies exist, they're having a minimal effect on the production decisions that farmers have. And this again, follows a general theory of economic policy, but it also is consistent with what we have through our political process, as well as through an analytical process, have determined addresses the basic concerns that U.S. agriculture has in international trade. And really, we see U.S. agriculture facing four big challenges that trade can help to address, positively or negatively, depend on how good a job we do in terms of negotiating agreements. First, we talk about foreign demand. 5% of our potential customers are here in the United States. This is a mature market. Our consumption is not expanding very fast. And we are awfully productive in the United States in terms of agriculture. And it's the 95, 96% of the consumers who are outside of the United States who are going to really determine whether or not we increase production and if we're going to increase profitability. And to the extent that these consumers outside of the United States can increase their income and increase their ability to spend money on food by expanding consumption or changing consumption patterns, we are going to create markets for U.S. agricultural products. And so this really is one of the core components of what we're trying to do, is create good economic policy globally to expand this demand, to find new customers and improve the customers we have. Now, the second thing, once we get past it, how do we make our customers more liable to buy our products, is how can we open up the markets that are currently, in many cases, difficult to crack. The best indicator we have here is that under the WTO, the average allowed tariff on agricultural products is 62%. So the tax that's levied at the border, if you bring in an ag product to whatever country, 62% on average. These tariffs can go as high as 700, 800, 1,000% in some cases. The U.S. average allowed agriculture tariff is only 12%. So this is a problem, it's an opportunity. How can we bring these tariffs down in other countries so we can access these bulk of consumers that are out there? Trade negotiations allow you to do that. Third, in a lot of markets we face competition from other countries who are subsidizing the exports of their producers. Under WTO rules right now, the European Union, our nemesis, the scourge of the world trading system, is allowed to spend $8 billion a year to subsidize exports, to write a check to an exporter to help them compete in a foreign market. They do recently they've spent $2 to $3 billion a year because of some of their reforms, but they can increase that if they want. We spend like $50 million. So this is again a problem for us to access those markets. We have this competition we have to face. So the fourth area that we see trade agreements helping access these foreign markets, helping provide opportunities for our producers, is with respect to trade distorting domestic support. And again, I'll just give you an indicator to start here. Under the WTO rules, the European Union is allowed to provide over $80 billion a year in what we call trade distorting domestic subsidy measures. These are things like input subsidies, these are things like price supports, these are programs which are going to change a producer's incentives to grow one crop rather than another, or more of a crop than they otherwise would. We've got a few too, and the WTO, we're allowed to spend up to $19 billion, so that's 1/4 the level of the European Union. And for us, these are programs like our marketing loan program, counter-cyclical program that benefit some of the row crops, wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, cotton. We've got a dairy program, we've got a sugar program, but we can spend much less than the European Union. Consequently, our producers are facing some competition that's getting more subsidy. So these four areas, increasing global income to create better customers, reducing access barriers for our products, principally by lowering tariffs, getting rid of export subsidies that allow governments to determine who wins or loses in an export market, and then reducing these distortions in production decisions, all would create a more market-oriented system, all would create better choices in terms of foreign policy in different countries. And for a country like the United States that's so heavily dependent on agriculture exports for profitability in the ag sector, are all important objectives for us. Remember, we export about $62 billion a year in the United States on ag products. For some commodities, we export about half of what we produce. Cotton, wheat, corn, soybeans, 30 to 50% of production is gone. Some specialty crops, it's even more. You know, here in California, almonds is an example. Without foreign markets, we'd be in trouble. So accessing those markets is very important, and why we are addressing each of these issues. There's one final area, a fifth issue that is important to U.S. agriculture that we're trying to address in trade negotiations, is our liability to legal action from other countries. Some of you may be aware of a recent WTO decision against our cotton program, which found that our cotton program was causing injury to other country producers and has asked us to make some reforms. Under the existing rules, we have this liability, and the cotton program has already been touched by it. Other programs are as well. So this is the environment that we see international trade having the ability to affect U.S. agriculture. And for a bunch of these, we have a chance in the WTO negotiations, we think, to improve the prospects for our farmers. And let me talk a little bit about what those are and what might come out of those negotiations. And I'll go through it in three basic areas. The first relates to market access. I told you the 62% allowed tariff globally that we face as exporters. We're protected by an average of 12%. Some specifics on that. The European Union's allowed agriculture tariffs are about twice ours. Japan's is around 50%. India's allowed agricultural tariff is over 100%. What you do in the WTO is countries make specific commitments. We say for beef, we won't charge more than 26%. For pork, we won't charge more than 1%. For dairy, for cheese, no more than 50%. For non-fat dry milk, 40%. For wheat, we commit to a zero tariff. Those are U.S. tariffs, generally. All other countries make similar commitments. Japan says for rice, we will charge no more than 700%. For beef, no more than 50%. For pork, no more than 250%. Oranges, 20%, and so on. So those averages I gave you are just a simple calculation of the level of protection. Our primary objective in all of our trade negotiations, and particularly in the WTO negotiations, is to bring those tariffs down that our exporters face, recognizing we're also going to have to reduce our tariffs. You'll hear again and again when you talk about agriculture policy, agricultural trade policy, WTO, the main note that we always hit is if we see market access, we're prepared to make reforms in our programs, but we need to see that market access. And it's driven by those basic principles I talked about at the beginning. Where we are in the Doha negotiations is that countries have agreed to a general principle that the higher your tariff, the bigger the tariff should be cut. And they've agreed to set up a type of a formula so that we ensure the higher the tariff, the bigger the cut. And we're at the stage right now where we just have to bite the bullet and see how deep those tariff cuts are going to be. Very hard, not so clear where we're going to get, but for developed countries, we're very likely to see cuts that range from 30 to 40% on the low end to as high as 70, 80% on the high end. And so this could have a dramatic effect in terms of the protection that countries are allowed to provide against imports. Again, it's a very open question, but that 20, 30, 80 range is where the countries have made proposals. But it's certainly fair to expect average cuts in the 30, 40, 50% range in agriculture, which for developed countries will create some new opportunities, getting into the European market, the Japanese market, and so forth. Developing countries, which again are the bulk of the consumers of the future, are being much less forthcoming in these negotiations. They'll point out the difficulty they have in competing with developed country producers who benefit from all the advantages of subsidy programs and educated workforce and stable capital markets and access to inputs and infrastructure and so on and so on. And the sensitivity they have in terms of dramatic changes in their rural populations, much more dependent on agriculture. And so it's a very open question how far we'll get the developing countries to open. But again, the key question here is how far can we bring those tariffs down? That's the first area of negotiations in the WTO and the primary area of discussion in all our free trade agreements. The second area that I discussed is the area of export subsidies. Now, what the WTO does is it distinguishes across subsidy policies those that are contingent upon export performance. That means you only get a check if you export the product, that's an export subsidy. Everything else is considered a domestic subsidy. So in Europe, remember, they've had a system in place where they have high tariffs, which keeps out imports. They've got high price supports, which encourage farmers to produce more and more product, and they end up with surpluses. But they can't compete because their domestic prices are so high, they can't compete in world markets. So the government steps in and writes checks to exporters to help them lower their costs and compete overseas. This has been the source of the export subsidy problem. Europeans have been big users in beef, in wheat, in dairy, fruits and vegetables, even wine. They'll use these to compete overseas. It's been a long-time objective of the U.S. to get rid of these export subsidies. And a couple of weeks ago in Hong Kong, China, at a WTO meeting, the Europeans and all the rest of the WTO members agreed to finally set a date when these would be phased out, and that's by 2013. So still a ways to go, 10 years from now, but we'll have an end in sight to these programs. It's important for us for both the commodities that we export that compete with subsidy. Dairy is a great example. Beef and wheat, the Europeans come in and out. Fruits and vegetables, a big problem. Both because we see a point when we won't have to compete against those subsidies, but we also see a point where it's going to force further change in European policy. If they can't use these export subsidies, what are they going to do with all the surpluses that accrue from the domestic overproduction that results from domestic subsidy programs? Their system eventually is not going to be able to sustain these mountains of butter and these lakes of milk. So it's good in its own right, but it's also good in terms of forcing policy reform. We've already made most of the policy reforms for us, so we don't use these programs much anymore. So that's a second area that we're going to see. And for those products that I mentioned in particular, it's going to change the global competitive landscape. Third area is trade distorting domestic support. And this is the one that we are probably under the most pressure on in the United States. We do have sensitive products where tariffs are delicate, where our producers are nervous about reducing them. But as I mentioned, by and large, our tariffs are pretty small. And while every percentage point counts, it's not an area that across agriculture generally there's a problem. Rather, it's an opportunity on the tariff side. But as you who follow farm politics and farm bill politics know, that's not the case on domestic support. We do have this allocation of $19 billion a year of what are called trade distorting domestic support measures in agriculture. Again, it's things that encourage farmers to produce one crop rather than another, or to grow more of that crop than they otherwise would. Marketing loan program, countercyclical program, dairy price support, sugar price support, those are the key programs. It's a question now in the negotiations of how far countries are going to reduce those. As with tariffs, we've agreed in principle, and we've agreed to a basic formula that would ensure that the higher your subsidy level, the bigger the cut you have to take. So the Europeans, with that $88 billion allocation, are going to have to cut more than us. But we are going to have to cut more than the rest of the world, because we have more of these subsidies than the rest of the world. How far remains to be seen. It's a negotiation. We've said that if we see big cuts in tariffs, real market access gains, we're ready to make big cuts in these subsidy programs, that we're ready to transform our agriculture policy away from the more interventionist price support programs to more generally available subsidies for our farmers. But again, for us to make this work, we need to see some market access in areas, in countries we're interested in. And this relates finally to this last point about litigation exposure. Currently under the WTO, our policies have been found to cause injury to other countries. We continue to face that exposure. If we have a successful conclusion in these negotiations, we know a couple things will happen. One, we will be reducing U.S. subsidy programs that are considered distorting. So that's going to help our exposure to litigation. And two, we're going to ask for some clarification in the rules that make it clear to us when we're exposed and when we're not. Some sort of protection or some sort of peace clause on subsidies is something we've put out there. So these are the types of policy changes that the Doha negotiations, the WTO negotiations, are driving towards, and the types of changes it's going to bring about in U.S. agriculture: less trade distorting support, less tariff protection, and some of the opportunities more open markets, less subsidized competition. How far we get is a very open question. Those who followed the drama in the newspapers or were in Hong Kong saw that we were pushing very hard on the European Union to open their markets, and we didn't get a whole lot out of them. We wrestled them to the ground on export subsidies. Okay, done. But we haven't gotten them there yet on market access, and haven't pushed them far enough yet on the domestic support side. And our strategy has been to focus on the Europeans first, recognizing that nobody's going to cut more than the EU. They're going to set the benchmark here. So first we have to get as much out of them, and then we'll turn to the rest of the world and see that we can drive the rest of the world also, the Japans and the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils of the world, to also open their markets. It's a very delicate issue, as you know, trade politics in the United States. We just passed our CAFTA negotiation by 1 vote. We just passed Trade Promotion Authority by 1 vote. And so no matter what happens, this clearly is going to be a big political fight in the U.S. But I'll finish with this, that we see the WTO negotiations not only providing a new opportunity for accessing these markets, which are so important to U.S. agriculture, but also for undergirding, supporting the system of the WTO as it exists today, that the basic rules of the road that organize and mediate trade between countries. So there's a lot at stake here. And we don't have much time. We've got to finish it by the end of this year to benefit from preferential legislative consideration. So that's a quick overview of how agriculture trade fits into our trade policy and what our objectives are. And why don't I stop here and let AG take it up.
Good morning, everybody. It's clear, looking at the room, we have quite a few trade experts in the room, so far be it for me to tell you what you already know. I have several points I'd like to make today as we talk about what California's role in global trade is, what it can be, and certainly what we'd like to see it become. I'd like to probably start with a few just statistics that you all have access to, that you all know, but make a few comments on those, and then specifically look at what I would like to say is some of the positive aspects. We all, I think, understand some of the negative, and Jason did a great job in underlining some of the negative parts of what keeps our products out of many markets, whether it's just tariff or whether it's just basic protectionism in a different way. And when you look at what we have here in California, this 04, the statistics we have for 04, and we certainly hope 05 will actually be better, we all should, with somewhat amazement maybe, but also somewhat expectation, recognize that we have surpassed $8 billion in our trade arena for the first time in 04, setting a new record. And that represents a 9% increase with respect to 2003 and a 25% increase over the 2002 numbers. And that's despite a shutdown of our Department of Trade, Commerce, and Technology department here in California. So it's clear that trade doesn't stop just because the government decides not to help or hinder, as the case might be, trade. Trade continues because markets and people that are determined to find markets for their products will be very ingenious and will look for those markets and push every new opportunity that they can. In California, we export to over 150 different countries, 10 principal destinations of those 150 countries accounted for 84% of the 2004 export value. And the top 4 destinations, Japan, Mexico, Canada, and the European Union, accounted for 2/3 of that total. And over the last 5 years, foreign markets have become not only important to California agriculture, but they also represent an enormous opportunity for us to expand far beyond anything that we've seen. In 1999, only 16% of the California production was being shipped overseas, and whereas in 04 this figure represents 22%. So you have to start to ask what's happening, and when you ask agriculture in the U.S., What is the benefit for trade agreements? What is the benefit that comes from active international, bilateral, multilateral agreements? You get a mixed answer, and you have to ask, again, where are you with your product lines? What are your opportunities? I don't think there's any garlic growers in the audience, are there? No, and I know there's been tremendous pressure, for example, on our stone fruit growers, because there are so many markets that are wonderful markets that if we could open them, would take our stone fruit in a second. In fact, it takes 13 years. I know many of you read recently that we were able to open up, the U.S. was able to open up the Chinese market to plums. Well, that's after 13 years of trying, and every other commodity out there that tries to get in, it takes many years to get those products in. And I think one of the things we'll have to ask all of, not this room, but where are the trade experts? Who are the trade experts that help push policy, that help push the government, that help push and open these markets? It's one thing to be a trader yourself, to be in the trenches trying to get your market open, showing up in Sacramento or in, more importantly, in Washington with a suit and tie on and pushing hard on, whether it's on USTR or USDA, on our foreign agricultural services, to get those markets open, whether it's a trade trip with our governor, whether it's not. It's the one thing to set up that relationship, but as most of us know, trade really is a business of relationships and using every tool you have to try and open a market. When you look at California's exports, it is an amazing world. My perception of trade changed significantly with the trip to China. I had been there 10 years earlier, and I'll be the first to say my 10-year-old perception of development in China was obsolete upon arriving there. It was phenomenal what we saw there. You can recognize that opening the market, say the new market, that not the new market, but the old new market of reopening the market of beef in Japan, we've lost $1.5 billion over the 3 years in those Japan exports of beef while the market was shut down because of BSE. We hear that today Korea might be opening up very, very quickly, very shortly, and we know that all these markets, when they open and close, they're huge opportunities, but also they can shut down a big part of where our product lines have to go and then back it up into the producer side and then create much more stress on our domestic markets. So trade is an important component, clearly, of efficient marketing. The opportunities that we see, and this is where I think all of us will agree, whether it's high tariff barriers or just the politics of keeping our products out, we have to scratch our heads and say, what do we have to do to make this global market more accessible? A good example is how many people in the world have had an avocado, how many people in the world have had an artichoke. Arguably, you got 5-point-something billion people that have never tasted either of those products, and those opportunities for getting those products into places that have never tasted them is one of the great things in the different product lines that California has, the 350 different commodities that we have. It is a great opportunity if maybe you have 10 or 12 or 15 of those commodities that are struggling to get into a marketplace, but you still have an awful lot of other products that no one else really has, that if you are creative enough, maybe we can open those markets. When we were at Chairman Thomas's trade hearing the other day, a couple months ago, I think one of the underlying things that I felt very strongly about, and Jason, you touched about it, is trade should be driven not so much by the politics of the world, but by the consumers of the world that want access to a global smorgasbord. If the consumers push hard enough, if the restaurateurs, food service people, if the chain stores, if the different ways of moving food around the world, if they're pushing hard enough and asking their governments to open up the markets because there's tremendous demand within their countries, whether it's Japan, whether it's China, that they want these products, they want access to these products. This is an incredibly important part of what's happening, I think, in the future here, and where the driver for international trade and the driver for this access to choice will put enough pressure on governments to get those markets open. Why? Because it's one thing if a lot of growers want to open a market, it's another thing if there's a tremendous demand by the consumers in there saying, we want those products, we want access to those products in a globalized world. In addition to that, we clearly have some new ways of looking at what are we going to do with the 6.5 billion people or more on this planet if we're continuing to see enormous enormous tragedy within the realm of malnutrition. Nutrition as a subset of what we're trying to do in agriculture, sometimes we lose sight of what is agriculture all about, and the truth is agriculture is all about creating abundance for the world. Now, might not be creating plums for every single person or strawberries or whatever the right crop is, but it does mean how do we raise a world standard of living so that everybody's moving from a survival state to a living state, and in that living state starting to, as Jason said, generate enough income so they have the ability to buy products and buy a healthy, balanced diet of food. In that arena, though, and I think all of us might, in this room, I'm sure, subscribe to the importance of trade, and believe me, I do recognize and believe in the great benefits of trade in terms of opening minds, opening markets, opening economies, but at the same time, I would want to underline one thing in this new position. For me, it's not that new anymore, I'm 2 years into this position, but the critical nature of the SPS agreements that we have, and more importantly, the critical nature of what happens in a globalized trading environment if we're not paying attention to the major priorities of pest exclusion, pest control, and making sure that we're not moving diseases, insects and diseases, and that whole complex of things, something that we should have learned over 10,000 years, that we have to be very careful in that arena. And so when we talk about trade treaties, when we talk about how important it is to open these markets and move these products around, whether it's imports or exports, one of the things that I will be very strong about, and that's in all the realm of this, and I'll have the same devotion to, and all the different ag secretaries around the world, basically ministers, have the same commitment to making sure that we protect from invasive species, and that we're able to detect, prevent, detect, or eradicate as they come. They will come whether people bring them in their pockets as tourists or whether we bring them through the trade arena. It's something that we have to have the infrastructure in place for, and again, infrastructure being what it is, it's one of those arenas that we've been very focused on here at our department, and I think it's something that's important. And whether it's CAFTA, whether it's any of the other different trade agreements we have, let's make those agreements move forward. Let's make sure and open our doors and create a better opportunity for trade. But let's not forget, let's definitely not forget, let us not have chronic amnesia when it comes to recognizing that introduction of non-native species into environment is not a good thing. In fact, nobody wants to be shut down in a quarantine. No one wants to have their product lines shut down because something took place and you're in an eradication process, and suddenly the global market shuts down to you because they don't want your product because you got a bug in it or a disease. Now, in looking at trade agreements, again, and talking about Chairman Thomas and his committee and the frustration, I guess, that we have, it's one thing to have the technical solutions to the different problems that in the trade disputes that we have. It's great to have science come out there and establish that a country is really stonewalling. I was going to use some other language, but because the camera's on, I'm not going to use that language here. But it's tough when you've done all the homework you have, your hands around, from the universities to the scientific investigators, and you know that your product should be able to get in, but it's just not getting in. And at what point then do we rely on government to really help force that? And when science fails to move the politics, what solutions do we have? And I think that's where we really have to depend on our governments then to take politics to politics and try and move our products in. And I think that's where we really have to put a little more attention, because in many cases I think the science is pretty clear that there's not a threat with many of these products. And it could be a two-way street in that arena, but it certainly is something that I think we need to show some true resolution of ourselves, that these are areas that can open markets up by bringing that political arm to bear to open those markets. And in that discussion of what governments can do, I think we're going to always be asking ourselves, is the level playing field, is that a myth? You know, we're always asking, we need a level playing field, we're banging on the table, we want a level playing field, but I have to ask, is that really a myth? Because when you couple, whether it's tariffs, but you couple the cost of production, for example, in California, one of the things that I think is driving our California Grown campaign is that we have done amazing things in California to achieve environmental and labor standards that the rest of the world is not following whatsoever. And yet we're willing to import any number of products that don't have those kind of intangible benefits to a society, to an environment, and we're trying very hard then to differentiate our product. And yet the cost of production is that much higher because we do choose to do those things. And how hard is it then to get our American public or the Japanese public or the Chinese product to make sure they understand that the products they are buying have those kind of benefits to a society, to an environment, and then it starts to take place around the world that everybody follows the kind of standards that we've set here in California. That's a hard sell, or is it an easy sell? Those are the kind of things that marketing has to really put into play for us, because in trying to achieve a level playing field, it's very difficult. Was for 50 years we were sending celery out of Orange County to Hong Kong and to Singapore on slow boats, 21-day boats. Now it was 11-day boats, and now it's even faster, I understand. But we're certainly in California. I'm sorry for myself as a celery grower, for example. We quit about 5 years ago in our area of Orange County because it's too expensive to produce that product, and we were just $1 short. I'm 90 miles away from the Mexican border, and they produce celery in the same season, and guess what? I was a replaceable supplier in that arena. I actually stayed in that business a little bit too long and lost a pretty good amount of money, and should have made that choice to stop production earlier. We can continue to look at our ability to create a differentiated product. I think that's one of the things that California will continue to try and push and try and establish, that our product is better, it has higher quality, it meets certain tangible, intangible quality aspects that make it a better product. But I think one of the things we're going to be focusing is on, all of you can focus certainly on many of the negative aspects, on trade resolution, on trying to open these doors, but I think one of the things we're excited about, one of the things I think we will push for is, again, this enormous market that is emerging, whether it's in India, whether it's in China, whether it's in Mexico, the rise of this middle class that wants a balanced, tasty, healthy diet. That's a huge marketplace. And again, if any of you have not had a chance to be in these emerging economies, whether it's India, or I haven't been to India yet. This one trip to China recently was, again, phenomenal. When you walk into the Carrefour markets, a French chain store, kind of a Target Plus, if you will, you couldn't believe the selection of global products in their food section. I was floored to see how much. Yes, we had a U.S. section. Yes, there was a little California section. We were thrilled to see that, but the offerings of food in these countries was exciting. It was just unbelievable how quickly a 21st century economy arises when they scrape away and take out the 20th century and replace it with the best known technologies of the day. And maybe that's one of the things I think I can talk to you about. We're going to be focusing on trying to take a farm bill, and everybody talks about specialty crops. It's not so much specialty crops that we're talking about, but it's crops that can be specialized, I think, is what we're really taking a hard look at. And whether it's the amazing rise in the trade of the whey products out of the dairy industry. I mean, there's a great export product that is suddenly in the last decade has come out of really nowhere into one of the best selling products we have in that industry. There's some great needs, and as long as we can invest in the technologies, in the marketing, in the promotion and outreach to make value-added products, that continues to move forward. When you look at the demographics of the food service industry around the planet in that middle class, you're seeing some great trends where people are not cooking in the home anymore. And so ready-made food, ready-made fast healthy food, fast healthy food for our country alone is going to drive a huge market here as we move forward. And if we start to see a movement of many of our farm products into the fuel sector, which I think we are, that just opens the doors even more for other products that people will eat that come out of the necessarily non-commodity sides. And so whether it's a year-round diet change globally, and that also goes back to the fact that whether it's driven by, let's say, a health consciousness because we're dealing with obesity, or it's driven by a realization by countries that having most of their nations sick and hungry, whether it's obesity or hunger, those are both forms of malnutrition, and the solution to malnutrition really is abundance from an ag sector, a global ag sector that can deliver that. And when these nations recognize that they're handicapping their future by letting their populations basically be physically unfit, and we're one of those countries, when we spend 97% of our healthcare dollars on after-your-sick costs, 3% on wellness and prevention, we're not that much different than Africa, my guess would be. If you think about the dollars that we can put into health prevention and nutrition and just awareness, this is a paradigm shift that would really change the role that agriculture has always played, but basically step it back up where it needs to be for a pretty interesting 21st century planet. And so let me finish by just saying this. I think we all recognize that for the United States to run in all product lines a trade deficit year after year after year, that's not in the best interest for this country. And domestic consumption our domestic consumption may be what helps build the underdeveloped world, but ultimately in this 21st century, I'm thinking that you're seeing the leapfrogging effects nations have to jump over other nations in their productive capacity. And in other words, how many countries have we seen come along that we never thought would be competitors in wine, in other areas, and they jump right past us in processing, and they jump right past us with 21st century technology to be world-class competitors in any number of products that we grow. We only have then a few things to be looking forward to. An enormous demand driven by this rising middle class of people that can buy products. 200,000, 200 million, 300 million. These are big numbers that have come up out of nowhere, and they're still increasing. We have to hope that our governments around the world recognize that that movement forward as opposed to back is better than a Dark Ages Renaissance decision here in the 21st century. And then we have to also recognize that in the United States, and specifically in California, let me just say, California, we have the ability to be, we have such great resources here, being ingenious, being progressive thinkers, being a little bit lucky that we get the technology first before someone else gets it, or that we exploit a technology first in food processing or any of those other arenas, or food safety. These are the kind of things that keep us ahead of that. But we have to recognize that replaceable industries, and I mentioned garlic only because out of nowhere it seemed like the garlic industry in the dehydrated section, in the processed garlic section, has just been clobbered by imports that they didn't either foresee or they failed to recognize were going to come on so quick. And in this day of communication and information availability, there shouldn't be any surprises for our ag sector. We should know what's coming. We should understand that China can ramp up and take away your broccoli market. They can ramp up, and with new biotech rice, threaten our rice market. They can do any number of things in this world, and there shouldn't be surprises because we have access to a global information base that should get us ahead of that. And lastly then, we talk about the two-way street. I know all of us in our different commodity groups as growers don't want to be roadkill on the two-way street, and we just have to recognize that there is that potential all the time that someone in another country is going to take your market away unless you're adequately differentiated, that you have protection because they want your product. And it might be asparagus in Stockholm. It might be a certain kind of cherry or something like that. Or it might be any number of other things that have, or of course a certain kind of wine that just, you've built your market and you're not really subject to market forces as much. So these are the kind of things that I think we need to work on. But more importantly, and maybe the most important thing, if there are, many of you might be legislative persons here, whether on the national or on the state side, is agriculture cannot find itself in a bipartisan struggle internally. Both parties have to support the ag sectors. They have to recognize that this is an important part of an economy of a country, critically important part of an economy of a state. We're not replaceable suppliers. We're an anchor industry, and we need the kind of support and convergence of the two parties to try and get us the type of things that we want. And here in California, that means grabbing a pair, not grabbing, that's the wrong word, isn't it? Grabbing a market share for ourselves globally and moving aggressively to open those markets with help, putting pressure upon our legislators to help us open jointly those marketplaces, and certainly in the Farm Bill being more creative. This is not a bill that should be a shrinking pie at this time in our nation. Our nation has to recognize that you invest in this arena and there is a return. Can't say that in many other areas of government spending, but if you invest in the Farm Bill and you increase those dollars, there is an absolutely calculated return. And I can't understand why this nation's moving in a direction of a shrinking pie investment in its ag sector at a time when it may, again, be its food, fuel, fiber. When we look at agriculture has to be doing well with 6.5 billion people on this planet. We don't have the luxury of not doing well. And so you have to invest in it because it means a lot for everybody. So thanks, Phil.
Thank you, A.G. and Jason. I'm going to invite Jason to come back up, and then we'll do questions and answers, and I will try to repeat the questions so that we can do it for television. Let's start here.
Yeah, Bonnie asked about food aid and how that's being played out in the WTO. And I talked some about export subsidies earlier. And remember, an export subsidy is when there's a payment to an exporter contingent on export performance. Food aid is an export subsidy. When the United States buys wheat at a high price here in the U.S. and gives it away to another country, we are subsidizing that export. But it's a justifiable export subsidy because it's addressing a particular concern. And so that's how it fits in the discussion. Now, in the politics of this, as we've been getting the Europeans to commit to stop using export subsidies in commercial markets, they've accused us of using food aid to dispose of our surpluses and to, in fact, leak into commercial markets. So, as the Europeans have committed to eliminate their direct export subsidies, we have committed that we would tighten WTO rules on the use of food aid so that we would, when we engage in food aid, we would not displace commercial sales of other producers. Now, how we do that is still up for grabs. The Europeans are saying the only way to ensure you don't displace a commercial sale is by not giving food, but by giving cash, and then let someone else buy it off the market. And we said, well, that doesn't have to be that way, and it can't be that way, because if you do that, food aid's gone, and more people are going to suffer for it. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how we'll discipline it. But it is caught up in this idea of making sure that when countries do export these products, they're not using government subsidies to displace other competitors. And we will see some new constraints here, but certainly our objective is to encourage as much or more food aid globally to meet the needs that are out there. Joaquin's question was, how does the dairy support program fit into our domestic support allowance in the WTO, and who agreed on that, and how do you calculate it? We have this $19 billion that we're allowed under WTO rules to spend on domestic programs which have some link to production incentives. Our dairy program is included in that because we have the U.S. government standing out there saying if prices fall below a certain level, the USDA will step in and buy milk off the domestic market. And so this price floor, this price support, can send a signal to producers to stay in dairy because they know that there's some protection. Prices aren't going to go too far south and the government will be there. The way that we calculate that is we look at the price support, the guarantee price, we compare it to a reference price of a world market price and say, say it's a dollar a hundredweight, what's our potential production that could benefit from that, and you get about $4.5 billion of the 19. So it's a big chunk of the support. What's interesting is we actually don't spend that money. The government is not writing checks, but there's a government guarantee behind the program. So as we move forward, there's some effort to try and be more creative in terms of how do we use this allowance to spend $4 or $5 billion on dairy and maybe be more WTO efficient in the way that we deliver it to deliver the needs of the producers. Oh, and these rules were set up by all the WTO members. They were agreed in our WTO rules, and we in the government calculate it every year, and then it's reviewed by the 149 WTO members to see if we did the math right. Roger's question was what are the chances here of landing the Doha deal? We had a big meeting in Hong Kong over December. We have a really pretty firm deadline, about as firm as you can get, to get it done by the end of this year. And we got big differences, particularly are the Europeans going to open their markets, and will that force other countries also? My own view is I'm guardedly optimistic. You have to be optimistic to get in this kind of work. You know, I started working on this negotiation in 1996, so I can't be anything but optimistic, or else I'll get suicidal. I think there's a couple things here. On the one side, trade is getting hard. You know, we've done a lot of the easy things. Now we're cutting tariffs on sensitive products. We're getting into our farm programs, reducing the distorting policies there. Globalization is increasing. There's a lot of political baggage. It's a hard deal, moving any kind of trade agreement. So we know it's going to be hard, and we know we need to do this stuff. It needs to be meaningful. That means we got to make big cuts, and that just makes it harder. European politics are a mess right now, you know, and who knows what Japan's going to do, who knows what the rest of the world's going to do. There's lots of reasons to see this thing going down. The reasons to be optimistic are that the opportunities are there, that there's global consensus on the virtues of getting rid of distortions in agriculture trade. Everybody agrees on that. And so it's a negotiating question, how can we line it up so politically it works? But there's global consensus. Agriculture markets are messed up. We've got to create fair opportunities for everybody. And we've got this WTO out there that if we don't find a solution to globalization, agriculture trade through the WTO, where else can we go? And it's not a pretty picture if you go back to the law of the jungle for international trade, where only the weak are subject to the strong. So there is going to be a lot of pressure for people to be reasonable here, to dig a little bit deeper and find what they can do. I know we're going to make a real big effort, but it's certainly nothing guaranteed. AG brought up this SPS issues, which are very important. And what we have in the WTO is a set of principles that say if you're going to try and block trade for a health or safety reason, you got to back it up. You have to have done a risk assessment. You've got to have scientific evidence. You got to choose a way to restrict trade that's the least restrictive possible. If you can do an inspection instead of a ban, do that. If you can do a regionalization instead of a complete ban, do that. So these are the basic rules that are out there. We've taken the Europeans to a WTO dispute because we say you haven't done that when you've blocked our biotech exports. You don't have a scientific basis for saying that Roundup Ready soybeans are not safe to use in Europe, and so you can't block that anymore. We expect a ruling out of the WTO next month on that. It's not really a negotiable issue. We really have these basic principles out there, and they've got to be applied on a case-by-case basis of has a country really done what they need to do. Sometimes it takes 13 years to make that case, sometimes quicker. But that's how biotech fits into the WTO perspective.
And I think what is becoming true is, I guess last year with the billionth acre of biotech crops was planted. You have France and Portugal have come back into that marketplace after an absence about 4 or 5 years as they've looked and watched to see how the biosecurities measures will take place. And so the viability of that enhancement to making sure that we can get a crop off is clearly being adopted globally. China is again in the lead with along with the U.S., Brazil, Argentina. There's just it's an interesting time here in the 21st century as we utilize and converge the technologies that are coming forward, and this goes across the board with the water technologies, the science technologies, the molecular ability to look at what we're trying to accomplish. We've never had a chance to see this kind of interplay of disciplines all at once, and so this goes back again to just those basic fundamentals we were talking about, chronic amnesia. We have the ability to converge the disciplines of science, the disciplines of agriculture. I've always said that agriculture uses more disciplines of science than any other human endeavor, and it is true. I mean, we are seeing some great opportunities to deal with environmental pressures, the pressures of malnutrition around the world, looking at the health of humans, the health of the planet, and what's starting to be seen, what we're starting to see is, again, the willingness to say, let's let science and the common sense of a planet, move us all forward. These numbers wouldn't be going forward the way they are, leaping the way they are, if we didn't see some great advantages in them. I hope that helps a little bit.